okay, if we do something different, maybe it'll affect the listener in a different way. And the idea was let's use sound as a vehicle to sort of grab attention in a different way. And I would argue that that's the lasting impression that I feel like in media it's so hard to get when you don't break format.
Welcome to Continuing Studies, a podcast for higher education podcasters to learn and get inspired. I'm Neil McFedrin, founder of Podium Podcasts, an agency for higher education podcasters.
And I'm Jennifer Lee, founder of JPod Creations. Podcasting is broadcasting. We want you to know you're not alone. In fact, there are many of you higher ed podcasters out there, and we can all learn from each other. Please also join our community at higheredpods.com.
So Jen, in this episode, we speak with Sam Harnett and Chris Hoff from the Ways of Knowing podcast. These guys are super interesting. I'm really excited about this conversation. After years in public radio, making and mixing stories that Chris and Sam say all sounded exactly the same, they wanted to make a radio show / podcast that didn't tell you a story or what to think, but they wanted to do a show that was all about sound instead of the language and the narrative. So super interesting where they have netted out. I really enjoyed this conversation.
I agree. I really enjoyed this conversation as well, obviously being in radio and loving sound. This was the perfect interview for me. Bless you. And unfortunately, we are a week late, not because Neil and I are lazy, but because we had some tech issues.
We had serious tech issues, like everything. We had an issue with our recording original interview, and Chris was so kind to book another time with us.
And then we had a fighter jet show.
We had a fighter jet show in that rebooking, but near the end of this interview, there's a couple of answers from our conversation that we've stitched in after the fact. So you might catch that, you might not catch that, but that was really kind of Chris to do that. But yeah, it seemed like everything we did for this episode, we hit up against issues. And I think all podcasters
sound issues
too. Ironic sound issues
which is ironic because if you listen to this podcast, we're going to get into it in just a second. It is like a piece of art. It's beautifully crafted. And actually, I'm going to say that I don't think, obviously, he didn't plan a fighter jet show, but actually, it's kind of fitting once you listen to their podcast that there were sounds in behind.
Yeah.
So it's kind of just ambient. It's all about this episode. So let's get into it.
Welcome, Chris and Sam. It's really nice to have you here on Continuing Studies.
Yeah, nice to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you guys on because I think you're probably the most unique podcast we've had on to date.
Well, there we go. That's something.
Hey, that's big praise coming from Chris Hoff.
Okay, why don't we just start with what is the world according to sound, and maybe just sort of a quick little insight into your backgrounds into podcasting.
We started this about 9-10 years ago, actually in 2015, and Sam and I come from the public radio world, and really the show was a kind of a reaction to the most forms that you get in public radio. Like we really started off as a strict sort of show focused on sound and not on narrative and not on talking. So we made this very short 90-second show for a couple of years. Each episode was 90 seconds and it focused on just like one particular sound, like the sound of mud pots at the Salton Sea, or the sound of a grizzly bear eating a carcass in Yellowstone National Park. And all we would say, we just kind of tell you what the thing was, and then we just listen to it for like a long period of time. That's kind of like an uncomfortable period of time in the public radio world. And so like we did that for a few years, and that morphed into this live 8-channel sort of surround sound show that we toured with at universities. We would, set up this ring of speakers. People would sit in the middle. We'd give them eye masks and turn off the lights. So it was this total, sensory deprivation thing. And we did that for 3 or 4 years, and that took many different forms too. And we finally landed on this thing that we're doing now, which is maybe slightly less sound focused, but still sort of driving our concepts and our narratives. And we're doing work now with universities on like really focusing on humanities work, I would say. That's the sort of short version.
Yeah, and the impetus for The World According to Sound, as Chris said, was to do something that was a reaction to public radio. And the 90-second convention and the focus on sound were just constraints that would break us from doing the traditional public radio narrative, interview, information-based piece. And then as Chris was saying, we did this traveling live show where we took all the sounds, we put them on the speaker array, and we did a show at Cornell. And when we were at Cornell, we met a professor named Jeremy Braddock. He brought us to Cornell for a semester to do a residency. And it was at that residency that we thought, okay, we've been doing this work as kind of a commentary on media and public radio. We've been really trying to experiment with the form and see what we could do with audio. And at Cornell, we met all these professors who had this great intellectual work, and we thought, oh, we can actually, using these things we've been experimenting with, we can sort of bring academic work to life in a new way. And that's when the Ways of Knowing project started. And the basic impetus of Ways of Knowing is how can we take what's happening in academia and represent it in audio without reducing it, without sort of pandering to somebody to give people kind of what they want or dumbing academia down. But still make something that lots of people in the general public would like to interact with. So the goal is in every season to make something that honors the work in academia, but also enlivens it through sound.
Yeah, and I thought it was so interesting to listen to, and my background is radio as well. So you always want to make sure that you're obviously doing things unique to get the listener to take that journey with you. So I love the fact that it started from there. But I also was thinking that this podcast is very David Lynch-esque. It reminded me very much of I don't know what they call it because it was a few years ago, I guess the continuation of Twin Peaks. And they have an episode in season 3 that is very similar to what you guys are doing. There was no actors or cast, and it was just weird sounds and lights and photos for an hour, and everyone was like, what did I just watch? And for your podcast, what I love is that it does that, but you are learning a lot of things. I was listening to the one that touches upon Industrial Revolution, and I actually have to say I found the sound effects of the gears turning very soothing.
Yeah, I kind of like that, but it's also the thing that your takeaway from that wasn't oh, I learned about, mechanistic materialism, but your takeaway was the sounds is kind of what arrested you, and that's what you remembered. And I feel like that's been a big thing in this work is, Sam and I have made hundreds of just feature stories for public radio, and no one's ever come back years later and told us that they remembered a story that we did on, gig workers or the homeless. But people remember hearing ants crawl over microphones 5 years later. So there's something to that, the memory. I mean, when you hear something you just aren't used to and you attach it to maybe a tiny bit of information, that thing really sticks in a way that me telling you that, the intricacies of homeless policy in San Francisco, that'll never stick.
And that gets back to, again, why we started The World According to Sound. I mean, I was a reporter at KQED. I was doing all this. I reported on tech and labor. I'm proud of the reporting. I had a beat. I established a narrative. I think that was really important and missing from the discussion of technology and labor. But as Chris was saying, I would do these stories on All Things Considered or Morning Edition or Marketplace, and people I know would call me up and be like, oh, I heard your story this morning. I'm like, oh, what'd you think? And they couldn't even remember the most salient details. They're like, oh yeah, it was about, they know the topic. It was about gig workers, or it was about Uber, or it was about Airbnb. And I started thinking, I worked really hard on that story, and it was I thought pretty good. And then I realized, the problem is that there's a format to it. There's a set length, there's a set narrative arc, there's a set way that you present the stories and the quotes. And that's when Chris and I kind of united. We had a long talk about that. And I was like, okay, well, if we do something different, maybe it'll affect the listener in a different way. And the idea was, let's use sound as a vehicle to sort of grab attention in a different way. And I would argue that, that remembering those gears, I bet you also remember some of the information or the ideas or the concepts, or you have a feeling for it. That's the lasting impression that I feel like in media it's so hard to get when you don't break format.
Well, sound creates a memory just like smell does, right? And so I think it would be a great tool, and more younger kids are using it a little bit to create more podcasts for kids kind of like this, because I feel like for me, I would have learned more and been able to retain the information. Like I said, I'm probably going to remember the gears turning for a long time and that information because it was interesting. I was telling Neil, I said, it's like it's a visual element, even though it's not a visual element, because I could picture the gear and then remember the actual history around the Industrial Revolution, where it was helpful, opposed to you guys just droning on, even though I'm sure you have great personalities. I'm sure you wouldn't make it boring, but droning on about the Industrial Revolution.
I'm curious. So, and now the focus is the humanities. Is that your interest that sort of took you there to focus in on the humanities? What we just were chatting about, that's audio, and it just lends itself nicely to bringing the academic side of the humanities to life.
I actually think probably the sciences lend themselves more to sound, but that's
agree. I would have said the exact same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So actually, I think what we're doing is kind of harder. I mean, one, Sam and I both come from a humanities background, so like we do have interest there, like a lot of like sort of theory, philosophy, stuff like that, literary criticism. But also, just like it's obvious, it's painfully obvious, working in public media or just media in general, that humanities are totally marginalized. Like maybe once in a while you'll get a social scientist. You'll never hear from like an English professor or a philosopher. It's all just like political scientists, economists, big time. And of course, like the hard sciences. And so it's just like for us, like humanities have a ton to offer that people don't even think about. And so we just thought this is a way for us to actually highlight those things.
It totally makes sense. And as you were talking through that in my brain, I was just thinking, okay, I've worked with a lot of university podcasts, and you're totally right. None of them are humanities.
Well, I think established mainstream media, like even the representation of science is sort of a caricature of science. I would argue kind of like a hyper rationalist take, like a scientist comes in to deliver a fact or to justify an opinion, and it's sort of being used, I would argue, in like a not very deep way. I think, if you look back at like the whole debate around climate change, like the ludicrousness of having all these scientists come on and like, oh yes, I believe in climate change, and oh, here's one climate change skeptic scientist, and like, are we really transmitting deep ideas about what's happening in science to the public? No, they were being used again because the format of a lot of mainstream media requires like a simple stance on a side, a simple presentation of a fact. So you're getting a very glancing blow from the sciences. So yeah, again, by going to the humanities, we wanted to go hard away from that. It's like, okay, there's all this great work happening in the humanities and social sciences. We're taking a non-traditional approach to the way we're making audio. That maybe was why it was like a good fit.
Your production, I have to say, is probably one of the best production podcasts I've ever heard, because it's just so crisp and clear. Do you guys do all the sound effects, or do you hire someone else to do that? Or does that come from your background?
No, we do all that. It's just Sam and I for all this stuff, which is actually a bit of a problem. Sam and I are good and talented, but it's just like
takes a long time to make it sound that good.
I mean, a lot of the recordings too is stuff that we've actually recorded over the years, but of course we've taken stuff and borrowed stuff from other people. It's not like, but yeah, all the conceptualizing, all the mixing and all that is just Sam and I.
Yeah, I think that it would have been impossible to start this project without the background that we have. I mean, between us, we probably have 30 years in public radio. Chris is primarily a sound engineer, and I was primarily a reporter, so we had like different skill sets. And then we spent a lot of years, like the first few years, the World According to Sound was really a side project where we were just experimenting and also like teaching each other stuff. Like I learned how to mix audio from Chris. I'm still learning. So yeah, the only real reason we could do it is because we had those skills and because we had like a friendship that we could work well together. But really, like if you listen to the Science and Metaphor show, I mean, I think that thing took us a year. I mean, we were working on other projects. We probably each were several hundred hours on that 2-hour podcast. And I think actually it should have been a team of 4 or 5, given all the like research, reporting, mixing, interviewing. I mean, it's just so many things went into it.
I know a lot of people are probably listening, like, that's a lot of work for a podcast, but that's why your podcast is so successful and so good. And I think a lot of people could take some of that knowledge. Yes, it doesn't have to be fully high produced like you guys do. Just use a little bit of elements, even if it is an interview format, even if it is a solo podcast. I think a lot of people need to tighten up their sound quality. A lot of messages are getting lost because more and more people are just hitting record and maybe not editing or getting it like smoothed out by a professional editor. And because everyone wants to be free and loose, that's fine. But it still needs to sound properly, because I'm not going to listen to like 5 minutes of fuzz.
I think part of the issue right now in the audio world is that it is very easy to create and distribute your own podcast at the lowest quality level. I mean, anyone now has a microphone and a distribution channel and can interview people. And I think actually, there's something powerful about that, and that can be done to reach a huge audience, as some people do. But there's so much content now. Differentiate yourself, I think you have to think about format. But that actually doesn't mean, I think, to do something very necessarily like highly produced in terms of sound design. Like I think it actually in the structure of how you think about your interview show or how you think about your narrative show, like the whole format, like what's the approach, like what's the intent. I think there's lots of creative things that could be done on a kind of lo-fi level. It requires thinking about format instead of content. And everyone thinks about content. Oh, we're going to talk about this. Like, well, how are you going to talk about it? What's the structure of how you talk about it?
Anybody can just do a sort of rambling, you can get whatever, two people together and just talk about X, and they're kind of, if there's no structure to it, why would you want to keep on listening? If you feel like it's actually going somewhere, that requires a lot of, pre-production and just like a lot of thinking to think through what everybody's sort of, motivations are, especially like in the academic humanities world. Professors are just, I don't know why people are like, who their audience even expects to be, if they're just sort of recording themselves talking to their buddy for a half an hour. Like, I don't know what they're even trying to really go for.
That's another thing to distinguish us too. Like the academic podcast, it is about the intellectual work that we are representing and transmitting, but it is also still about making like kind of novel things in audio. So we have like kind of an ulterior motive. Like in the Science and Metaphor show is a really good example of that. Like instead of making, individual podcast episodes, we made like a 2-hour podcast. The whole thing is sound design. The audio spatialized. It's like this kind of journey. Like that for us was to make a thing that would be hopefully something people would want to listen to for many years, and a thing that's interesting in part because of its intellectual content, but in part as a piece of audio.
I love this line of thinking beyond just the content, but thinking about the format and how much you two put into thinking about the format and listener on the other end. That's really interesting. I think that's a great challenge for us all to not just think about the content, but to think about the format and to put some consideration into there and consider the audience as well. And to your point about just a professor just sort of deciding to hop, a couple of professors or whatever, hopping on a mic or talking, I think that because the bar is so low, there mistakenly sometimes is this attitude of, oh, their colleague has had this show for 3 years and look at the success they're seeing and they want that too. And so they kind of just think they're just going to, couple of guys hop on a mic and away we go. But there's so much more to be considerate about that we've just discussed here. I'd love to dig into how each season is different, but also each season is a new relationship with another university. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? Because you've worked with a number of different institutions over the last couple of years, if I have that correctly.
Well, we've released 3 sort of seasons, and each one is with a different university. It's been a University of Washington, Johns Hopkins, and University of Chicago. And we got 2 more coming with Claremont McKenna College and Cornell. And then, probably some other stuff after that. But those 5 are sort of definite. And
well, the 6th season will be a follow-up with the University of Washington.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yes.
Right. But it really depends again on what we're trying to make this our livelihood essentially. So like money and resources are an obvious factor in that. And so we sort of cast a wide net, and like we are working with people who do have at least some funds, to help us make these things. So that's like one thing. But the other thing too is just that, like every university or humanities center at universities, like they have different interests. And that to us is really exciting too, because so for example, we just released a series on the role of metaphor in science with the University of Chicago and their Humanities Center there, the Institute on the Formation of Knowledge. And that topic just happened to be something that they were super interested in at the time. And it wasn't on Sam and my radar, but they sort of brought that up. And we thought, oh yeah, that seems like a really good idea. The ideas aren't all from us, but it's just like being at different universities with different sort of faculty, like people just have different interests. And we kind of say, okay, that's going to work in audio or it's not. But yes, it is a sort of give and take. Like it's not all just us. And I like that there's all these different institutions, and some are, public schools and some are private schools. And I think that's really good too. We don't want, a bunch of podcasts made just like Yales and Harvards. Like it's nice to be with other kinds of institutions too.
Yeah, and I would add, so basically every season is a different university and a different topic and a different format. And for us, it's really about finding a topic that will lend itself to sound so that we can do something sonically interesting, doing something that the university is excited about and you can use. And as Chris said, it varies. Sometimes it's a university wants to highlight a certain kind of research or a certain kind of idea, and sometimes it's more. They want to have something that students can really listen to and get excited about taking courses. There's like a wide range of what the desire is, but the partnership works because the university wants to make something sonically ambitious and interesting and academically rigorous. And we think it's an idea that we can do something really interesting in audio with, and that intellectually there's some depth. I mean, the science and metaphor, again, when we first talked with them about that idea, I was like, oh, it's so broad, it's vague, and science, we usually kind of steer away from it. But then I realized, oh, metaphor is this thing that people don't usually associate with science. And through the history of metaphor and science, we can offer a critique of the way science is often portrayed in contemporary culture as something that's like hyper rational and kind of divorced from the humanities. So there's like this critical angle that was of interest to both of us. I think maybe that's like the third piece, so it has to be something that's, we can do something sonically with, something that's intellectually rigorous. And I think it is something that there's some element of critique in it. Chris and I both find interesting.
Is there a topic that you would love for a university to do that you've never done yet?
Oh, yeah, there are a bunch. There's one, again, I spent 10 years covering tech and labor, and there's a couple things in that reporting that I would love to work with the university to do a deep dive series on. One is really about the story of economics and like how economics has kind of dominated cultural thought in a very powerful way. And I'd like to trace that, like how econ as a discipline sort of became very homogenous. Like there's a very uniform way of thinking across econ departments, and how that is bled out into policy. And so that's something I would love to do. And then just tech and labor, again, I think there's a big story to do there on work and what we think of as labor, and looking at conceptions of technology across time and how technology has been represented in certain ways and has a certain perception in public discourse. So those are two. Chris, what about you?
Yeah, actually, I mean, there's a couple, but we're working on this topic right now that actually is really interesting to me. It's really about the sort of present state of not just humanities, but of the university, of the American university. And it's something that's really broad topic, but really we're sort of interested in these questions of why it's so expensive now, all these things that are kind of obvious to a lot of people. But the reason for this seems to be that sometime post World War II, after the GI Bill, and all these people sort of got access to college education, a bunch of middle class people got into college education, this seemed to be a real sort of fear for the ruling elites. Basically, I was really interested in sort of how the American university has become sort of so profit driven and seemingly corporatized, and how you have this dichotomy of super left-leaning faculty and ideas are all very left-leaning, but you have administrations and real power structures are super right-leaning, and that's where the actual power is. And so this combination of these two things, you have this mess now where you have all these culture wars going on at these universities, and there's this really sort of, to me, this really interesting kind of nexus between these sort of left and right powers kind of battling each other. But of course, it's all couched in universities are all leftist and Marxist, and they should kind of be reined in, but that's just not the truth. The truth is the power at universities lies in conservative, sort of principles. And I just think I'm just really interested in that.
In a nutshell, the documentary / podcast is going to be about the neoliberalization of higher education. It's basically, why is higher education so focused on profit? That's what all students are thinking about. How can I make money? Universities are, trying to build their endowments. Everyone's fighting for professors and grants. And that's what, again, as Chris was saying, when you think about higher education, it's oh yeah, it's liberal, it's leftist, it's progressive. But if you actually look at how higher education operates in America, it has an extreme profit motive that seems to align very much with conservative ideals. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm really excited about this podcast project because it's going to combine a lot of reporting and critique along with sound design stuff that we've been working on.
I think it's great. I feel like you could dive into so many things on that, because I think there's a lot of people talking, and things that I've listened to lately or seen on TV is that a lot of the most successful people don't even go to post-secondary education, or they drop out. So what are they learning that we aren't learning in school? A lot of people are like, oh, I didn't even finish this. And they go on and made millions of dollars and stuff. Sometimes I feel like education, that's a whole deep rabbit hole go into, is what are you learning, and is it appropriate for what you need?
Right. People who go to universities feel like they need to make money coming out of it because you're spending $50,000 a year in tuition or whatever. So if you're going to university, you're going to make sure that you have a skill that can earn you money. Like you're not going to study philosophy. You're not going to do linguistics. You're not going to do classics. You're going to do business, science, whatever you can make money with, engineering. It's like impossible to go study a thing for its own sake. Everything is now about the bottom line. Yeah, I'm not just going to learn art history and go on my merry way. But that's just, to me, that's the opposite of what a university should be. If you want to do the other thing, go to vocational school or, do an apprenticeship. But you go to a university to become like a person. I don't know, but whatever.
Yeah.
Wow. I love it. It's a super interesting discussion. You guys are really up to some interesting things for sure. I do really like, back to Jen saying how unique you are. I mean, like, obviously, your dedication to audio, high production is so unique, but also how you're working with a multiplicity of institutions, some of which are topics led by them, some are topics of interest that the two of you have, and then you're finding the university or academic team to align with. I think is really a really interesting way to think about this. I also think that we kind of like quickly glossed over it, but the recognition that what you're creating is evergreen. What you're creating isn't just a season and, hey, university, come along with us for a season, and that's going to be 2023, and we might move on to 2024. Each one of these is, yes, a season, but it's also a body of work that is there to, explore and come across 2 years later.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. Because the cost to make these is so high, it requires so much time and effort that it wouldn't be worth it if it was just you release it, you get the people who are followers to listen then, and then it's over. Like the real idea is that these are, again, evergreen for years or, hopefully even longer. So the University of Washington was the first season we did, and every episode featured the work of one professor as a kind of entry point into a way of knowing in the humanities. And we're doing a second season with them because they were so happy with it, which is great. And their idea is that they're going to send these episodes to incoming students, hopefully. And I think, again, that's like really great of this series, with the idea that it would draw more students to take humanities courses. And, that could be done for years. The Science and Metaphor show that we just made, we spent a long time on the sound design with the idea that eventually we could turn it into one of our 8-channel live shows. We could take the sounds, as Jen was talking about, like the sounds of all those gears. We could put them on our speaker array, and it could be this sort of immersive 60-minute show about science and metaphor. And so that's something that could happen, maybe not next year, but maybe in a couple years. We're working on a series with Cornell about media objects. Every episode is a different object around us that influences the way we communicate and think, and things that we don't normally think of as media. So the first episode is going to be on the push button, on how buttons sort of shape the way that we communicate and think. And those are extremely heavily sound designed. They're like kind of sonic essays. And that's a similar thing that we're thinking about it as like, this is a thing that could have longevity. We're making them. Those actually, the Cornell series, I would say the most is like we're doing actually like intellectual work on our end. Like we're working with these professors to do a bunch of research, include all this media theory, so that the episodes themselves could maybe be something that a professor uses to teach. Maybe freshman media theory students would listen to these episodes that have like references to Kittler and McLuhan and a bunch of other media theory folks, but in this like sonic way that's very different than how you would digest written material. So we're always thinking with each of these projects, it's always different, like what the avenue will be. But, this isn't just a podcast. It's always like, okay, this is like, we're going to do this concept in audio and make a thing that hopefully could be a teaching tool, or it could be a way to recruit students. It could be turned into a live show. We did a museum exhibit a few years ago with some of our audio, and that's a thing that we're thinking about maybe doing again. So it's like, okay, maybe we'll work with, maybe the media objects thing could eventually be some kind of installation someplace. And for us, that's the only way that we see a future for us as a business. Is basically we need to make content because, we want to make really highly produced content. And the only way to get enough money to do that is to make stuff that it's so good that people are excited about it and it has longevity. And if it doesn't, then we're kind of cooked. And, the jury's still out. I mean, we've been doing this now full time for 3 years now, Chris? Or 2.5? We've got funding for another year and a half. And hopefully grants will come in. Hopefully more money will keep coming in so we can continue to work. But it's a bit of a gamble. But it seemed a better gamble to us than to make the low bar stuff and try to break through, because we're not interested in that. B, I think often it's kind of harmful to just like pour more content in. I think you could end up doing more damage than good in the media world. So this seemed like the kind of only path for us.
I think you guys are on the right track, just because I've seen a lot more. I know you're not scripted, but you kind of fall into that scripted podcast with huge productions. And I think as people consume content, I hate to say the new way because it is a newer way, but then at the same time, a lot of the stuff people are doing is very similar to radio plays and things like that. It's just kind of having a resurgence, but in a younger demographic, because they're saying that so many young people now just consume way more audio than they have traditional aspects. So I think you guys are cutting edge.
And there's so much being in the podcast space. It's like video, last
Right.
couple of podcast conferences I've been to. It's like video. We need to be doing video. We talked to our Spotify rep and you got to do video. So what you guys are saying is the opposite here.
Yeah.
It's like there's something still about audio. Back to the beginning of our conversation with Jen talking about that one episode with the wheels turning or whatever and how that creates a memory. I think we're very short-sighted to want to try to do video as podcasters, which is hard. And instead, hey, maybe we should focus a little bit on our audio format and remember that a lot of people are listening to us while they're driving or while they're walking the dog or so on, and which is how we sort of interact with audio. But what you guys are doing is just is really awesome.
Yeah, I also think it really depends on really like what your motivation is. I think, if your goal is to make money with this stuff, that probably means you're going to need to get advertising for it, which probably means that, yeah, video probably actually does make sense because people like watching video. But like our whole model is not that at all. Like we actually don't want advertising. And frankly, it's also, for me, I don't really like watching, the whole point of an interview show is just two people talking and giving me information. I don't really need to see them. It's not interesting to me to watch just two people talking. Listening actually makes more sense.
And I would say the whole video thing seems very much driven, as Chris said, by ad revenue and also by internet platforms. And I got news for you. The internet platforms don't give a shit about you. And look at Facebook and Twitter and like LinkedIn, or even Spotify. They're all, who knows what they're going to be doing in a couple of years? Will Twitter still exist? Will some other person buy it and turn it into their personal megaphone? I think making content based on the internet companies and internet platforms is a very dangerous, slippery slope. And so, yeah, you're going to invest all the time making video, and then a couple of years they'll change the algorithm and they won't care about video anymore, and then you're screwed. So, and let's remember, millions and millions of people still listen to the radio.
Yep.
I mean, we've got an interview on Science Friday coming up about the Science and Metaphor show, and several 100,000 people, if not 1 or 2 million people, are going to hear that.
Right.
I really actually think the public radio or the radio audience is not something to be neglected.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're still huge and they are dedicated listeners, and they're sort of proof that audio doesn't need video.
Well, audio, they say, will never die, and I truly believe it. I think radio, especially here in Canada, it's just changing its vessel, going over to podcasts because our radio is seeing a decline, but it doesn't mean that people aren't listening to audio. It's just, we got to keep making great content that people are going to want to listen to. That's really it. I could get into it with you guys about video podcasts because I totally agree. I think there's a searchability factor. I think you have to be on for that. But I think some podcasts don't need video because the video looks like they're recording it in their grandparents' basement, and I can't deal with it.
Agreed. Well,
and
we
on
all
that note,
agree. We all agree. No video on your podcast.
or at least start by being more intentional with your existing audio and your
or
format.
set up your Zoom screen properly. Don't have half your head missing.
Yeah, there you go. Anyway, so amazing to have both of you on today. Thank you so much. And it was really interesting unpacking and hearing more about your journey, and looking forward to tuning into more seasons and more episodes ahead.
All right. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's been great being here.
Jen, that was great. Really interesting conversation. And I just love digging into some of the more interesting parts of podcasting from an audio perspective with two incredible audio nerds.
I love audio, and I think that's the thing that a lot of people don't appreciate enough in podcasting or in radio. And it's kind of circling back now because I know companies that are doing full productions, but they're all podcasts that are scripted. And so they have all these huge soundscapes. And yeah, it seems like a lot of work, but it really, when you listen to their podcasts, it makes a difference. You feel like you're there. Not to say that everyone needs a full soundscape, but definitely sound leads you
Mm-hmm.
into the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I also really liked their approach. I think it's super interesting how they're working with different universities and institutions and faculties for each season, and how they're being true to what they're trying to achieve, which is focusing on the humanities, using audio as such a key component of it and really leaning into that, but then working with different folks for each season and really just changing it up each season. So like their episodes were like 8 minutes or something like that. Then this season, the first couple of episodes come out are like over an hour. And then they've got these longer form projects, almost like research projects that they're digging into. That also really opened up my mind as far as how we can work within this field of higher education and how we could collaborate more on a given season with a given focus of a given topic and think about more of it as evergreen content.
Not to always bring it back to radio, but I'm going to. The thing that they understand, and it goes to the length of the episodes, is you don't always need a long episode. And really, your content is going to dictate the amount of time that's needed to tell your story. If it's 8 minutes, if it's an hour, but just be strong. And that's the same thing we're always taught when we're in broadcasting is like, say it in 60 seconds, say it in 5 minutes, but it better be strong no matter the length that you do it. And they do an amazing job about it. And I think that's a thing that, in podcasting, everyone's trying to figure out is what is the perfect length. There is only a perfect length for your content and your content only. Some people are better at telling longer stories. Some people are better at telling shorter stories. It doesn't matter. You don't all have to be the same. It's whatever's stronger for the listener to go on the journey with you.
Right. And the one consistent thing that they're leaning into with Ways of Knowing is using audio and really high production audio as this vehicle for telling their stories and just taking us into this really interesting place. So, well, I think that's another episode. Jen, why don't you read us out?
So thank you for tuning into the Continuing Studies Podcast, a podcast for higher education podcasters. We hope you found this episode informative and inspiring. If you enjoyed the show, we encourage you to follow and subscribe to our podcast on your preferred platform so you'll never miss an episode. But if you found this episode particularly valuable, please consider sharing it with your friends and colleagues who also might be interested in a higher education podcast. We also invite you to join your peers on higheredpods.com, where you can connect with other podcasters in higher education and learn from others in the field. Thank you for being part of our community. We look forward to continuing to bring you valuable insights and conversations around higher education podcasts. See you in the next episode.